Over the weekend, Iran's president called on Asian countries to create an alternative to the United Nations. He blasted the UN for being ineffective, and he's not alone. A majority of Americans also believe the UN should be scrapped. Lee Webb has that story.
After years of division, deadlock, corruption, and accusations of widespread failure, the UN's next Secretary General is vowing to restore trust in the world body.
I will leave no stone unturned in my endeavor to dispel the bitter atmosphere and shore up the trust and confidence among all the stakeholders.
But today, the building that sits on Manhattan's East River faces a crisis of confidence. Polls show that a majority of Americans believe the UN is no longer effective.
The 22nd session of the United Nations General Assembly meets in New York.
The UN was founded 61 years ago to stop wars and promote human rights. But since then, some 52 million people have been killed in conflicts. From Rwanda to Bosnia to the latest war in Darfur, Sudan, critics accuse the UN of doing a miserable job of preventing wars and even genocide. Some believe there are too many nations in the UN that simply don't care about promoting democratic values, but instead seek to prop up brutal dictatorships. Case in point, Iran and North Korea's decisions to ignore UN resolutions highlights the agency's weakness in confronting some of America's enemies. Meanwhile, debates on Israel abound. The General Assembly has repeatedly condemned the Jewish state, but not once has it adopted a resolution critical of Israel's enemies. Some accuse the United Nations of fostering a climate of anti-Semitism. So whether it's a failure to protect human rights or stop a war, a growing number of people believe the United Nations should be scrapped and replaced if it cannot be reformed and made more effective.
Well, joining us now is Nathan Tabor. He's here to talk about his new book, The Beast on the East River, The UN Threat to America's Sovereignty and Security. It's actually a good read. I was having it over the weekend, so I recommend it. Nathan, I mean, you raise some issues in this book that I just find incredible, that you actually think the UN is a threat to American sovereignty. Why do you say that?
Well, when you look at the research and look at the documentation, when we ratified to become part of the UN in 1945, the United Nations was set up to protect the sovereignty of the U.S. But now when you look at from education to environmental control to population control to our military, they are destroying the Constitution of the United States and are really attacking the core values of our family and the sovereignty of the United States.
Well, you just said something very strong. They're destroying the Constitution of the United States. What are the specifics there? What are they doing?
Well, take the military, for example. Under Bill Clinton, he put Presidential Directives 13 and 25 in place. And in 1996, Michael New was honorably discharged from the military and court-martialed for refusing to sew a UN patch on his uniform. Well, in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, it says the Commander-in-Chief is to be over all the Army and Navy. Well, how can someone be discharged from the military for not sewing a UN patch when he's under the control of the President of the United States?
I think a lot of people are just, we find it hard to just wrap our minds around this, that the U.S. President would issue a directive that apparently is secret, and what's in this is unavailable to us as citizens. And in this Directive 25, he says that he's willing to transfer control of U.S. troops to the UN. And that's the basis for this young man being court-martialed. I just find it incredible that we would voluntarily do that, and the Senate and Congress wouldn't have any say in it, or our courts wouldn't have any say in it. Is that just the case, and are we sort of at the mercy of a group of elites that wants to steer us this way?
Well, I think so, because when you start looking at the documentation from our presidents of the United States, both Republican and Democrat, and then what the United Nations is doing, there is this underlying goal to make this new world order, from taxing authority, from education. The No Child Left Behind, when you start looking at United Nations documentation, they believe that the family is the threat to the New World Order. So they believe that hey, I've got your kids longer than you do, so if you're not going to go along with what we're doing, we're just going to teach little Johnny in school that the sovereignty of the U.S. does not exist. I mean, pick up your kid's book. Does it talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and our founding fathers being Christians? Or does it talk about becoming part of the quote-unquote global community? If it talks about the global community, that is the United Nations plans. And unfortunately, majority of our elected officials have gone along with that.
Well, I think a lot of us have. Let's just pick some of the current situations in the world that are dangerous, and look at the genocide in Sudan. And I know a lot of people have called for the UN to step in and send troops into Darfur to maintain control and to bring some kind of peace to that region. But your book points out that when the UN steps in, the UN soldiers actually are worse than the militias, or are identical to the militias that they replace.
Oh, time and time again, example after example. You know, the one French Union officer of the UN in Congo raping 12-year-old little girls and filming it and then selling the tape. He was on a plane and out of Congo and back into France, and no charges ever brought against him. So I think that's, you know, something we really have to look at. Once they get there, are they bringing peace with morals and values, or are they just coming in and stopping what's currently going on and putting into a worse situation for these folks? And I think that's what we see is happening.
Well, let's look at Iran. The UN Security Council is trying to move towards sanctions as Iran seems bent on developing nuclear weapons. Is that something that we should support, the UN trying to intervene there? I mean, the Iranian president's saying the UN's worthless, we need another body now. What's your opinion on that? What should happen there?
Well, I think the UN right now is a lot of bark and not very much bite. So I think that is something that we do need to establish, something outside the United Nations that actually does have control, that has the ability. Because until the UN can get taxing control, the court control, and military control, they are just this empty suit that unfortunately the United States is funding 20% of their budget, and the countries vote against us 80% of the time. If you had an employee that voted against you 80% of the time, I'm pretty sure I know what you would do.
They wouldn't be here long anyway. All right, well, if you're at home and you're interested in this, I encourage you to get The Beast on the East River, the UN's threat to American sovereignty and security. I mean, it's one of those you know, sort of catch-22 things where if it becomes effective, we don't want it, because then it's a threat to our own sovereignty. And in the meantime, it doesn't seem to be able to do anything anywhere. Anyway, it's available nationwide. You can find it in bookstores. Nathan, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. God bless.
Terry, over to you.